So welcome back to the Science and Sport podcast with myself, Mike Finch. I'm here with Professor Ross Tucker. And on the other side of our Zoom call is Gareth Davies, the man that looks after our Discourse channel and keeps us informed of all the latest news happening on there and around the world of sport. So he's kind of a producer and a content guy and very important to our podcast and how we get things out into the zeitgeist for you. So we apologize that we've been offline for a while. Ross has been traveling around and attending various conferences, and we've just been unable to get together and make things happen. But we have a subject today that, by full disclosure, we actually had recorded this once already. And then while we were recording it, when we were about to put it out as a podcast, we decided that actually there was more to the story than we had initially thought. So we took a couple of days, we put our thoughts together, we put our evidence together, and we decided that we were going to re-record this very podcast. So you won't obviously hear the first one, but you will hear this one. And the reason why we're making a big deal of this is that because this is a very interesting topic in the world of sports science, because one of the most respected, and I say respected, publications, because it is influential in the world of sports science, the British Journal of BJSM, British Journal of Sports Medicine, is one of the biggest publications in the space. It is one that is regarded as legitimate and puts out a lot of studies and is obviously very important in the sports science space. However, in the last couple of weeks, we've experienced an interaction with them, not only Ross at a conference, which you'll talk a bit about now, but also we've tried to get them on the show. So full disclosure, we have tried to get them on the show to talk to us about this, and you'll see why later, why it was hopefully, we were hoping they would come onto the show to explain some of their things that they've done. But Ross, maybe just take us back to the conference that you were at, where this first came to light as to this subject that we're going to get onto now. Where were you?
I was in Coventry, which is Gareth can tell you where that is.
Somewhere in England.
Somewhere between
in the Midlands. It's a bit grim.
Somewhere between London and Edinburgh on a train. I got there. I was invited to present at the British Association of Sports and Exercise Medicine, which is the largest gathering of sports and exercise medicine specialists in the UK. And I was invited there by its president to give a keynote address on the opening morning. It was a 2-day event that they have annually. So it was a really cool conference. I met a lot of you listening to this. Some great interactions over football and at the dinner. I really thoroughly enjoyed it. But on the second morning, there was a presentation session that was scheduled in which a panel discussed injury approaches in female sport. And at this particular session, there was some discussion about transgender women in sport. So in your introduction, I don't know if you introduced the specific subject of today's podcast, but maybe I've done that now. This is not a podcast, though, on those specific things. It's more a podcast about how the discussion of those specific things begs questions of the journal's position, and more broadly, how it occupies a space in a polarized debate.
Yeah.
And whether a scientific journal should do that. Because what then happened is the conference was Thursday, Friday. Sunday, a tweet was sent by the British Journal of Sports Medicine's account on X. And in that tweet, they promoted this session with some words we'll get into because I think they matter, as well as 4 pictures, the third of which is a slide that contains what the presenter, Sheree Bekker, presented as a juxtaposition of what the Trans Women Have a Sporting Advantage group believes, and then what she believes, and what she calls the feminist sports approach, which we can get onto. And it's like watching the summary of like red versus blue, left wing versus right wing. It's like, here's what you think at your poll, and here's what I'm telling you is the truth at my poll. And this tweet got a lot of reaction on X. We'll post it in the show notes.
Yeah.
And it's the promotion of that tweet by BJSM, which then invites, as I say, a look back at some other things that the journal adopted on this specific subject. That was the catalyst for this. But some of the stuff in the tweet we have to address because we can't frame our discussion around the journal without doing so. But it's some of the dumbest stuff you're ever going to read.
Well, I mean, let's just take a step back. For you as a sports scientist, if you look at this journal, what role does it play in the space of sports science globally?
When I
What role
was
do you think it should
when I was
play?
a student, so now we're going back some time, this was the best journal to publish in because it was widely respected. It had the highest, what we call impact factor. And an impact factor in the academic world means that if your article's published in there, it's more likely to be cited by other articles because it's prominent, it's featured widely. A lot of it is to do with promotion, but basically it's a journal that if you could publish in would propagate your work, your theories, and your ideas more widely than all the other journals in the sports science space. And then even after I finished studying, it became even bigger. And it was led at the time by a guy called Karim Khan, who was a really, I think he was quite good. Like I know there's been some criticism of him at times overplaying the marketing side of the scientific journal, but I think he recognized more than most that the sciences also need to be translated and promoted. And so he was quite proactive about doing that for the scientific journal. And so BJSM started to take the opinion that it invited more what are called narrative reviews and invited more counterpoint debates. Karim himself, I think he said this, so I can say it, was an advocate for low carb diets. And there was a period in which the British Journal of Sports Medicine became like the place for low carb diet discussions. And sometimes, as you know, like we've had those discussions, they can become quite antagonistic and adversarial. But he was open to that, and he would publish, here's a viewpoint in favor of, and here's someone saying against those. And so that's where the journal gained even more momentum in terms of its public profile. So it was accused at that time of maybe sometimes becoming too provocative and not rigorous enough. But I think for the most part, really good. And it still is. Like when we're doing all this work on instrumented mouth guards and we're working with students, they still want that. We say, where would you like to publish this? They will say, we want to go there because it's still got that reputation.
So in the day when Khan was the editor of it, and he talked about the fact that he was looking at different sides, for me as a journalist, was the underpinning of either side of those arguments always based on science?
Yes,
Or
but
was it opinionated?
no, it was both though. And actually, this is quite an important point, is that science is not devoid of opinion, as much as you would like it to be, especially the sports sciences, because I mean, this podcast owes its existence and it's, I dare say, a big part of its listenership to the fact that many of the subjects we cover are gray. And you and I even have sometimes, like, let's call them creative tensions, but they're not even tensions. There's actually good things where you'll say, can you simplify that for me? Well, no, I can't. You'll ask a question and the answer almost always is, it depends. If we ever if we ever produced a line of Science for Sport coffee mugs or t-shirts, like a catchphrase would be, it depends.
Yes.
Because a lot of the stuff we do, the low carb stuff, does a supplement work, does cooling work. Okay, that one might not be so much depends as probably not. But there's a lot of stuff that we've discussed on this podcast in the last 5 years where there is a little bit of subjectivity and nuance because you're dealing with complex physiology, systems, team environments, whatever it is, talent ID, it depends. Doping in sport, it depends. Any subject you discuss can be framed as it depends. And so when a scientific journal then offers itself up as a platform to discuss those issues, it is going to invite a degree of, let's call it interpretation more than opinion, but two scientists looking at the same how about 13 studies? Because that'll come up in a bit, the significance of that number. Two scientists looking at the same 13 studies might reach different conclusions about what to do about those studies.
Right.
And so that's where the journal didn't shy away from it. But to answer your question, it invited and at least hosted both sides of that debate.
Yeah. I mean, the basics of what they talk about on their website, and just to really drill it down to its very nub of what it says on its own website, it says the British Journal of Sports Medicine is a twice-monthly peer-reviewed medical journal covering sports science and sports medicine, including sport physiotherapy. Just explain for those of people listening at the moment, when they say peer-reviewed, is that meaning that people within this space review research that goes into this publication to ensure it's rigorous enough to be published?
Exactly that. So, and this structure is quite important. I submit my paper to them. They've got a submission portal now run online. It lands at the desk of the editor. Now, I'm not sure exactly how they organize this, but eventually it goes from the editor down to an associate editor. So if you go to the website, you'll see a list of names of associate editors. Those are people who've been identified and asked by the journal to fill that role with content-specific expertise. So there'll be someone there who's an expert in rehabilitation, orthopedics. There'll be someone there who's a musculoskeletal expert. There'll be someone who's an expert on injury epidemiology, in exercise training and rehabilitation, for instance, cardiovascular medicine. So when my paper goes there, because I submit it with keywords, with a heading, obviously, there's a subject. Someone reviews that and says, you know what, this is perfect in the wheelhouse of Tommy. Send it to Tommy. He's our associate editor. He handles it from that point forward. Another paper goes and it's sent to Joe, right? Another paper goes, it lands up on Emma's desk. Because they're recognized by the journalist being the expert, they handle it. That associate editor is now, in effect, its gatekeeper. They send it to 2, 3, sometimes 4 people and ask, will you review this paper? So now, like, let's say it lands on my desk. I've been asked by the journal to review it. I then look at it. I say, look, is this thing method-wise, is it robust? Does it have sufficient sample size? Have they identified specific enough questions? Has the research been done in a way that it is fit for publication, freed from bias, not making wild conclusion statements and so forth? And if I do, I make some comments, I send it back. The authors then have a chance to respond to that. Usually at that point, everyone agrees it's ready for publication. A lot of the time, more often than not, it gets rejected. Like this journal will reject far more than it accepts. But if it makes it through that first round, it's usually going to end up published with a little bit of iterative back and forth. Does that process make sense?
Yeah.
But the reason I labor the answer to your question is because that associate editor and those reviewers are really important to whether or not something gets accepted. And every academic in the world listening to this knows the frustration of sending something and then feeling like you didn't get a fair review. Like this person just hasn't given this thing. And part of that is just human defensiveness. Of course, my work's ready for publication. What do you mean it wasn't robust? Obviously. But a lot of the time, like you feel, I didn't get a fair shot at this. And that's important.
And this is all literally about making sure that whatever is published in this publication is credible.
Exactly. And maybe, Gareth, I'll bring you on in this. On our discourse channel at the moment, Joe Warren, who was a guest on this podcast and has done a lot of work exposing what's called the replication crisis in the sports science, he's recently posted something and he's made the point that a lot of the time the people reviewing this are not qualified to review it.
Yeah.
And so, do you the specific context of that, Gareth, can help us out with a little bit. But it's the intention is that there's a standard, there's a bar that has to be cleared for scientific research. And so you can see why it's a good system. We audit one another, but it's a system that I think, for many reasons, just is creaking.
Right.
Yeah,
Gareth?
I'm sure that Joe won't mind me actually reading one of his posts. We were talking about how things get published and by who. And he says, actually, there's no qualification required to publish anything in science. Anybody can submit anything they want. And it's something that they're looking into. How is it possible that to be a chartered, say, physiologist, I can never say that, for example, you need to pass some difficult exams that are additional to a university degree. But to be a researcher, there's no such quality control. So what he's saying is, in the world of science, anybody can submit papers, and that's a strength and a weakness, obviously.
Yeah, my point to that is like that's the submission side.
Yeah, but there are gatekeepers.
I think that's good. Myself, like, I understand exactly what Joe's saying. I don't disagree with him. But I'd add to it that, and I did on Discourse, is I think it's quite good because you'll find people who are not PhD trained who have better ideas, solutions, and systematic thinking and robust approaches than people who are. We might get into that. But I think it's quite good to invite anyone to submit. But the problem is then on the flip side of that, the people who are gatekeepers, they have to be really good because otherwise it's a free-for-all.
Yeah, I mean, that's what Joe is saying. He says it's a strength that the process is that anybody can actually submit. But his last paragraph is that he thinks the mistake is that both the barrier to entry of submission and the quality of work that accepted have been lowered. So if the latter, as in the quality of work, the acceptance procedure was propped up better in a more robust system, it wouldn't matter who was submitting it. So it's the second part, it's the peer review system that needs to be boosted, really.
Yeah, and I think where we're heading with this is it's not only the qualifications of that reviewer, it's what they believe.
Yeah.
That's the problem, right? That's fundamentally the issue that we're discussing today.
Let's move on to say, why is it important for this content that's published to be given some robust look at? In other words, why is credibility important? Why should we care about what BJSM publishes? What impact would it have if they didn't have this process and they didn't have due diligence?
Because we wouldn't know where, quote unquote, the truth lay if anything made it through at poor quality. Because there are too many ways in scientific research that you can have biases and mistakes and errors that give you a slightly or sometimes very different answer to a question that you ask. And I mean, specifically, like we've had interviews with people here who've shown that drinking beer enhances recovery. Because if you don't control that study, you find that. It's ridiculous. So that's a daft example. But if a scientific journal loses its position as a trusted source of knowledge, then where else would you go? You'd be left on Twitter.
Yeah.
You'd be at the whim of Elon Musk. So the scientific journals have to rise above opinion, and they have to at least filter out what can't be trusted so that what's left is more trusted. It's never, as we made here, the point is it's never 100% trustworthy. But if that process lets down the credibility of the work and specifically the interpretation of that work, because we're moving into here a subject it's not straight up physics where, you know, you can measure down to the nanosecond what happens. The interpretation of that work matters a little bit. And if a scientific journal abandons its place as a trusted and largely neutral platform or library of that truth, then the truth is the victim.
Yeah. And I guess the results is, if stuff that gets put up is seen as real, potentially there are physical dangers when something is done that the science has been misused. I mean, obviously there are lots of implications.
Right.
And we can talk about this.
I'll give you exactly specific example in this context. This trans woman in sport. Do they have an advantage? Yes or no? The Canadian Centre for Ethics in Sport publishes its report. They conclude there's no evidence at all. In the last 2 or 3 years since that report was published, a lot of people on social media say, look, here's a report from an leading institute that shows no, it's rubbish. It's absolute nonsense. Like, I would not pass a third-year undergraduate student for writing the quality of work in that thing. It wasn't peer-reviewed, though. And if it were, it shouldn't have been published in the form that it was.
Right.
So its failure to be peer-reviewed undermines its credibility. The flip is also true, right? The flip side of that. Something that is published is going to be held up by people saying, look, here is a paper from 8 independent academics. Okay, they're not always independent. 8 academics. And it says X. Therefore, it adds weight to my argument. I believe X. Here's academics who say X. I'm stronger as a consequence, right? And it's peer-reviewed. I'm much stronger as a consequence. The problem is what happens when there's an argument Y that also has, but that's what the scientific journal should be doing. It should be putting both into what you called earlier the zeitgeist.
Yeah. Okay, so let's talk specifically about this tweet, and we have mentioned it a little bit, but I'm going to read it out. Now, let's be clear that this tweet came from the British Journal of Sports Medicine, BJSM as we'll call it. It was not a presentation by them, but it was supported by them. And it talks a little bit about, it says, women injury and prevention at this conference. And it was talked about, our esteemed panel expertly tackles the big questions and issues. The first one, the spectrum of gender in sport, with a comprehensive review of the 13 studies surrounding the transgender sporting advantage claim. And then there's some discussion afterwards on the ACL injuries and concussion in women and girls, Project ACL. So there is that discussion about women's, particularly sports issues. But of course, the one that genders most of the reaction is the discussion on gender. And without giving away too much, because we'll get into some of the details here, and Gareth and Ross are going to take you through the slide. Now, when we go through the slide, what we would suggest is that we will put the slide up as a link in our show notes to really follow this have a look at the slide if you can. If you're listening to in the car, obviously you can't do that. We'll do our best to try and explain it to you, but have a look at the slide and you'll get a good idea of what we're talking about. But some of the reaction to this post was you had an evolutionary denier as a speaker. Men's superior physique is contingent and socially constructed. This is completely disingenuous. What utter nonsense. Sex matters. Men are not women. Men who take drugs are not women. Men whose puberty is disrupted are not women. Men with cosmetic surgery are not women. Castrated men are not women, etc., etc. So the reaction to this, and you'll see this in the show notes. We'll put this tweet up on our show notes, and you can listen to the many reactions to it. In fact, every single one of the reactions is negative and really talks about how this is not something you would expect to get from the British Journal of Sports Medicine. So, Gareth, I'm going to ask you to take Ross through some of the slides here, because on the one side, and you'll see on the slide, there's a TWSA claim. What is TWSA again, Ross? I know that you can roll this off your tongue quite easily.
Trans women sporting advantage.
There we go. And then the other side is the feminist sport approach. Now, the TWSA claim, and we don't want to say this is Ross's side, but it's kind of is Ross's side. That's the claim that says there is definitely male advantage in trans sport. In other words, if an athlete was previously a male, biologically male, then basically transitions into a trans athlete, them participating in sport is not a good idea, particularly on sports like rugby, etc., etc. But there are lots of sports we can talk about there. On the other side is their response to this claim. First of all, and as you mentioned this before you kick off here, Ross, what you're saying is the TWSA claim, which is what they claim is what your group is saying. They're being disingenuous in what they have said there. As you've said, they've told you what you are supposed to be saying, but actually you're not actually saying that. You want to just pick out some of the things from there that you feel are disingenuous in terms of what they claim you're claiming.
Well, all 7. Look, if this thing's a debate, that column doesn't exist because the one side gets to put its case. Whenever you see a debate where one person is debating it with themselves, you should be saying, hang on a moment, what's going on here? And so all 7 of those, like the second one, in fact, the first one, sporting performance is explained by biology. Second one, sporting performance is due to muscle size and strength. The final one, men's superiority to women is purely a physiological matter. Nobody in their right minds, with any even basic understanding of sports performance, would use words like purely, like sporting performance is due to muscle size and strength, and not other factors also. Sporting performance is explained by biology without saying partly explained. Even largely explained would be better than what they've claimed it to be. So the perception from I don't want to use the word like one poll in this debate, but that's what it is hang on a moment. We don't say that, but you're saying we say that so that it's easier for you to offer the counterpoint. And that's not a good debate method at all. It's weak.
Right. Okay. I mean, for me as an outsider, when you look at their column on the left-hand side, the trans women sporting advantage claim, it seems to make sense because there are nuances to this. And I think that's what people need to understand. So when you say sporting performance is due to muscle size and strength, what is the correction on that?
Sporting performance differences between males and females is in part due to muscle size and strength differences that were created during male sex development.
Right.
That's factually accurate. Nobody should ever dispute that is true.
Right.
But when you frame it like that, then you can say what they say is that strength doesn't apply to all sports. There are many other physical and social characteristics that contribute. Because you see, that statement in isolation on the right-hand side, strength doesn't apply to all sports. There are many other physical and social characteristics that contribute, is also true.
Yes.
So both sides of this thing are true, but they're being held up in juxtaposition with one another. It's just silly.
Right.
Like why this is polarizing it unnecessarily. Because nobody, like when Hilton, Tommy Lundberg and Emma Hilton wrote their first paper, when we rebutted the International Olympic Committee's position stance on transgender athletes in sport, their eligibility guidelines, we produced figures that very clearly showed that there are dozens of physiological systems that create the male-female performance differences. They are cardiovascular, they're respiratory, they're muscular, they're tendons. Some of them aren't even classified menstrual function. You know, they don't even exist on both sides of the sex spectrum. Well, the sex binary. Sorry.
Yeah.
So like nobody believes that it's due to muscle size and strength, but they do say that it's partly because of that, because it is. It's factual.
Gareth, but maybe you can pick out some of the things that stand out for you, and you and Ross can sort of debate. We're not going to go through all of them, but some of them are particularly inviting.
I just want to preface this by saying that I really don't like this topic. And when you were reading out some of the Twitter responses there, I'm not sure that was the best thing to do, because what we don't want to be is part of a pylon. Because this is Twitter is a bit of an echo chamber, and you've got to respect other people's views, even if you don't believe in them. I think that's probably fair to say. But even when I read this slide, that's why I forwarded it to Ross in the first place. He's obviously already seen it, is because I thought, hang on, some of these don't sound right. But if I was looking at this without reading the Twitter responses first, I'd be thinking, well, this sort of sounds a little bit reasonable. So you've just talked about the sporting performance is due to muscle size and strength is the claim. And then the feminist sport approach. And actually, I just need to bring that up. They're calling it a feminist sport approach. But if anything, isn't this sort of anti-feminist? Because it's actually reducing women's rights. Would you say that's right?
It's only anti-feminist if you believe that there are two sexes. But you see, what Sheree Bekker, and in this instance, she's written a book about this with a guy called Mumford. What they believe is that trans women are women. So they believe that trans women can identify into feminist movement.
Okay.
So that
explains why they've headed it that way.
Sport, but they genuinely think that this is the feminist sports approach. But you're right. This is someone high profile once said to me, this issue is the ultimate manifestation of the patriarchy, but they would believe it to be the other way around. That's how flipped over this thing's become.
Okay, so if we look at the reply to the muscle size and strength debate, they say, no, this sounds reasonable to me. I'm going to say that. Strength doesn't apply to all sports. There are many other physical and social characteristics that contribute. That seems a reasonable reply to me.
Yeah, of course.
What do you think, Ross?
It is. It's a very reasonable statement to make, but not in opposition to what it was made, because what was put into the words of the other side in the first place was a straw man. But as I just said, I think that if I was to edit, if let's say if this was submitted to a journal and I was reviewing it, let's say, hang on a moment, that sentence only works if you say strength doesn't apply to all sports. There are many other physical characteristics also affected during sex development that contribute to male-female advantage. It's not a rebuttal of male advantage in sport. It's a standalone statement that works, but it doesn't work as a rebuttal because it's incomplete. And as I just said to Mike in that context, nobody believes that it's not also cardiovascular, respiratory, tendon, neurological, reproductive, in the case of the menstrual cycle, that only one sex has. So of course there are physical, and of course there are social characteristics. The social thing, they like to pretend that the social and environmental side have been ignored by people. But the problem is, like, we have coaches, right? There's talent ID in women's sport. There are coaches, there's training. Everyone understands the need for investment into women's sport. Nobody thinks that males alone should have sporting investment. It's obvious that women have to have it. So of course, social characteristics make a difference. It's if you understand even the slightest thing about the history and the evolution of sport, you'd know that women's sport is in most sports a generation or two behind men's because of a lack of investment. This is what a lot of people are fighting for, is equal investment in women's sports. And now this denial of biological sex has hindered that.
Let's,
fair enough.
Gareth, move on to some of the other ones, because
I was going to move on to another one. Yeah. And so the claim from, I'm going to say it as Mike said, your side, Ross, the sporting advantage claim is that there are sporting feats that only men can attain. So is that a correct statement? Is that what your side is claiming? I hate to use the term your side, but we're going to use it.
Yeah, so again, the nuance here, like if I was to correct what we believe, and I'll say we, is that at present, in a matched sample, male performances are superior to female performances because of biological sex. That's accurate, right? But the way that it's framed and it's you got to understand the intent of that statement is what they are arguing, and it's the feminist sport approach, as they call it. You can read it out, Gareth. The counterpoint to it.
The feminist sport approach is that women can and do achieve the same as men, but usually later.
So in other words, in 1954, the best marathon run in the world was Jim Peters running 2:12-ish. Women are now running 2:10. Therefore, give them time, and women will...
209 actually.
Yeah, sub 2:10, you're right. Give them time, women will catch up to men. But the problem is now what you're doing is you're comparing something from 2024 to something from 1954. Oh, yeah, sure, then you're okay. Yeah, like, okay, so you're saying that in 70 years, performance improves? Well, yeah, okay. Right. But so they're saying that very specifically to argue that the only difference between male and female performance is that women are behind in the maturation and growth of their sport. In other words, given sufficient investment, given sufficient resources and support, and enough of them participating, male versus female advantage would disappear. That's the thesis here. Now, it might not come across in that line, but that's what's presented and that's what's argued, is that were it not for the suppression of women and men would be equal in performance.
I mean, it blows my mind that to some extent, because even as a non-sports scientist or a medical person, as a journalist, it just seems impossible that somebody would think that.
Well,
because by just looking at the male versus female thing that there are course advantages.
Gareth, you were going to say something there. Let me let you finish that thought.
Well, yeah, I was going to say, are they saying that if women's sport continues to develop as it is, that the performances will merge at some point, that men become equal with women?
Yes, that's exactly what they're saying.
Okay. See, this is where I'm trying to be neutral, but it's
Now,
really difficult to be neutral.
No, but you have to. I think it's important to do that, and I appreciate that you are, because so let's explore that. I'll use rugby as an example because it's home ground for me, as it were. If the South African women's team today played the South African women's team even 3 years ago, they'd wallop them by 40 points. I think the same is true of the Six Nations teams. Ireland recently invested more, not enough, but more into their women's rugby. That Irish team today would beat the Irish team 4 years ago by 30 points. That's true of every women's rugby team in the world. Maybe England, 10 points, because they were further along in their development 5 years ago. The point I'm trying to make is that women's rugby was really slow to start building momentum. Now that it is, the teams are improving rapidly. Every generation is much better than the previous. Same situation men were in 30 years ago. The teams today would hammer the teams from 1995. They're just bigger, faster, technically more proficient, more tactically. They would hammer them. Like some of the 10th ranked teams then now would beat the best teams back then. Does this make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah, but you also said there, Ross, that they are actually bigger and faster now because of training.
Yes. And so there are papers, Woodhouse et al., who have documented, even in the last 6 or 7 years, that female rugby players are faster, bigger, more powerful than they used to be, because they're now in better training environments. They're getting better coaching, better conditioning. And let's be honest, as the game grows, better athletes at baseline are coming into the sport. So there is an evolution of sport that drives performance. This is the socioeconomic and environmental factors that make a difference. So that should be relatively obvious. What it is not is a prediction. It doesn't work as a prediction that given enough time, those females would then also be able to outperform the males. That's the problem here, is how you take that reality and then use it to predict the future. Now, if you go back 1992, Brian Whipp and Susanna Ward wrote a paper, and it was published in Nature, which is a pretty good journal. And I mean, it looks like an April Fool joke, but the headline was called "Will Women Soon Outrun Men?" And what they did was they took the marathon performances. Remember, this is in the late 80s, early 1990s. And women were only really running the marathon. Remember, the first time in the marathon was run by women, 1984 Olympics in Los Angeles.
Yeah.
Men have been running it for 100 years. So they were that far behind, almost 100 years. And what they did was they said, right, let's project forward. If the women's marathon record continues to evolve at the pace that it has been for the last 15 years, by 2000 and something, women will be running faster than men. Now, the flaw in that thinking is that performance will continue to improve linearly. It clearly doesn't. Every single record that you look at over the last 30 years in track and field, the gap between male and female has now stabilized. It is no longer coming down. Before that, it was coming down because in the 1970s and 80s, women were at the same place as rugby is today, getting better because more athletes, better investment, better coaching runs. That's no longer happening. So that statement only works as a prediction over a cherry-picked time frame in which the gap was narrowing. The gap's no longer narrowing. And then the final counterpoint is, I guarantee you, I could find in the rural areas around Cape Town, kids from impoverished backgrounds who've never had any training environment, and I could find a 16 or 17-year-old male who's better than the world record holder for women.
Mm-hmm.
Because male advantage is so large that even that female athlete with all the investment, all the resources, 10 years worth of training, still can't overcome what testosterone has given that 17-year-old boy, despite none of those environmental concerns. So those counterexamples puncture a hole in that theory comprehensively. It's a laughable statement.
That is. That's one of the ones that really stood out for me. Gareth, anything else there that stands out?
It was the final one that we were going to look at was the claim on, I'm going to call it again, Ross's side, men's superiority to women is purely a physiological matter. So that's the claim. Ross, is that fair to say?
No, and there's a few problems with it. The main one is purely, I don't think anyone believes that men's superiority to women is purely a physiological matter. And the other point I would object to is the wording of that. I don't think men are not superior to women. They're just
it's missing
different.
the word sporting there, perhaps.
Exactly. So to be precise about that, what we should say is in sport, male advantage compared to females is partly a physiological matter. Or because the physiological advantage is clearly the physiological advantage is clearly physiological, but the performance advantage between men and women is in part physiological, but it's in part because women's sport is just not resourced as much as men's is, and it needs to be resourced more. But to say men's superiority sounds like that, and they're doing this on purpose, by the way. They're trying to portray the trans women sporting advantage group believe that women are inferior, and we don't. If anything, the likes of Emma Hilton and those who've advocated for protection of female sport believe that females are equal, if not superior, because of some of the things they have to overcome in sport. And that the reason we have a female category is to recognize that equality as opposed to inferiority. That's an unfair framing of it to begin with on the left-hand side of that table.
Okay, well, look at the right-hand side, the feminist sport approach. And the statement is, women's lack of sporting success cannot be explained with invoking social justice. Now, I think that's a typo. It should be without invoking social justice.
Pretty key typo, actually. When
Yeah,
you're trying to make a conclusion.
Yeah, it is. If you're trying to make a conclusion, your last point. So I'll read it again as we think it should be, but I don't. It's difficult because people could accuse you of changing their words, I suppose. But women's lack of sporting success cannot be explained without invoking social justice. Tell me what that means.
I'm going to assume, again, I want to be careful not to make the same mistake, but let's assume social justice means societally women have faced more difficult circumstances and barriers that men haven't in sport and outside, like, to be clear, but we're a sports podcast, so we'll play there. And they're referring again there to the inadequate investment in resources, coaching, finances. Like you look at cycling, women are riding for peanuts compared to the men. It was only recently that the Tour de France began what is now a 10-stage, 10 is it 10 or 8? 8-stage race. Only recently we saw Paris-Roubaix for women. We still don't have a Milan-San Remo. They're earning far, far less prize money than the men are earning. So that's an example of where social factors have held back women's cycling. And by the way, the performances we see in 2032 in women's cycling will be relatively better than 2024's compared to men's. Would you agree? Like, they must be improving much more than men.
Yeah.
So it's another example of what we're saying. Will Demi Vollering ever climb at 6.7 watts a kilo like Pogacar? No. And it's not because of muscle size and strength, by the way. It's all the other stuff. So you can find any counterpoint. But let's come back to this one. Women's lack of sporting success cannot be explained without invoking social justice. They're saying that those social things have to be factored in to how we understand men's versus women's sports performance. Sure, no disagreement from me at all. Again, that does not refute the influence of biological sex on the male-female sports difference. I just think it's offered as a gotcha, you guys are wrong, and actually saying, hang on a moment here, like nobody arguing for the protection of female sport would dispute that women's sport is not invested sufficiently. And that's why right now there are 2 lawsuits in the United States fighting against the misuse or failure to apply Title IX. Now, Title IX is a law, it's a regulation in the US that compels universities, among other things, to fund women's sports equally to men's. Title IX was created precisely to address the social, let's call it social justice, but the failure to invest in women's sports over the decades. And they said, now you must fund and support women's sport in your university programs. If you don't then protect women's sport for female only, you are not doing that. So Title IX is at stake. It's one of the key battleground areas in this debate, precisely because the denial of biological sex influences the social factors that are then have to be overcome.
So one of the things that talks about in this particular tweet, and this is I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this, is they talked about the 13 studies surrounding the transgender sporting advantage claim. What are they referring to in terms of the 13 studies?
So one of the slides they didn't share in that tweet was a slide a couple before this where Sheree Bekker actually put up a tweet that I'd shared. And I remember it actually quite well. There's been a lot of debate in the trans women in sports discussion around whether you can include males. I'm going to say that because I'm interested in biological reality here. Males who identify as women into women's sport without it being unfair and potentially unsafe. And people say, well, what's the evidence for that? Because we're saying that it would be impossible. And this is one claim they should have put on that thing is if sporting fairness and safety for women cannot be achieved together with the inclusion of trans women in women's sport. That because of these physiological differences that cannot be overcome. And Sheree Bekker's side will say that there's no evidence for that at all. Whereas we're saying, hang on, there are, and I remember replying to a tweet on this exact issue. There are currently, at the time, there were 13 studies looking at what happens to biology and physiology when testosterone levels are suppressed in males. And without exception, they show that there are slight decreases in muscle mass, muscle strength, muscle area, that partly, but not entirely, close the gap between male and female before that testosterone suppression had occurred. And it's on the basis of those studies that we're saying that you cannot remove male advantage and therefore it would be unfair. And so they call it, and they use air quotes around it, the 13, and they try to argue that there are only 13 studies that support that. So that's in essence what they think the 13 studies mean. And they say in the tweet that it's comprehensively, do they say debunked or comprehensively?
In terms of the tweet,
yeah,
there's a comprehensive review of the 13. So they're not saying one or the other.
You can't comprehensively review anything in a couple of slides, but yeah, that's what the 13 means. It means that there are those 13 studies that have shown that testosterone suppression slightly reduces, but doesn't come close to removing what is known to be male biological differences compared to females.
Yeah,
and that's the basis for arguing that it's unfair and potentially unsafe for males to enter into women's sports space.
Yeah.
So that's the science side, the science of the trans side of it, which we've discussed so many times now.
For sure.
But why is this so important right now?
Well,
why are we talking about this today of all things? And is it because the BJSM are supporting this? Is there a thought that perhaps the BJSM has been captured by ideology and politics?
Yeah, there is. I think that's true. And I mean, the captured, and then you can use terms like wokeness and so on. Not a massive fan because I think that means different things to different people, right? And I think it's become weaponized a little bit. I dare say that some of these issues were influential in a recent election. So you know that it's societally very important, but it has been polarized to the extent of weaponized. But there's biological reality here. And the problem with it is the moment you deny biological reality, the consequence is that you're going to undermine the integrity of women's sport. And women have a right to fair and safe sport. So the reason this is important and the reason it comes up is because when a high profile, credible scientific journal shares those 7 points, effectively endorsing them. Because in the tweet, they use the little round of applause emoji. Well done, speaker, for saying that women will achieve the same as men. Well done for saying that men's superior physique is contingent and socially constructed. For saying that sporting performance isn't explained by biology. Like, that's what you're saying as a scientific journal. Now, that has to be called out, because the consequence of not calling that out is an alternate reality.
When you, I mean, when you were there, were you there when they were delivering that slide?
No, I was at another session, and then someone messaged me saying you'd better get here. So I left the session I was in, and I didn't make it in time to hear the specifics of that slide. I got the back end of Bekker's presentation, and I got the question and answer session, in which she said other things like combat sport differences are gendered. She said no reason biologically that male and female combat sport can't be mixed.
Well, there was a example that she gave, which is a bit frightening.
She was asked a question from someone from combat sports in the UK. I forget whether it was judo or boxing, and she invoked a study by Channon in which men and women were sparring together. I think it was boxers. And she said that in the beginning, the men are very hesitant and cautious. They don't want to punch and spar as aggressively as normal. And the women are also nervous. But you give it a few weeks and the women improve and the men realize that they can punch a little harder than they thought. Therefore, gender is massively important to combat sport, and there's no reason. And we've created a physiological or biological difference when actually it's all about gender in combat sport. I thought, oh my God, what are we listening to?
That's scary, that, isn't it?
She also said in response to one question that this tension between inclusion, and by inclusion they mean inclusion of trans women, and fairness, safety, is a red herring, and that you can in fact have both. How? Like, I cannot see how it's possible. Like, yeah, they will criticize only 13 studies. I would argue that it's 13 studies plus evolutionary biology, plus thousands of papers that look at male-female advantage, plus a number of case studies. There was a UN report recently, 800 and something podium places have been taken by males in women's sports recently. I think the 13 studies...
As a trans athlete, in other words. Yeah.
The 13 studies make a prediction about what would happen if a male enters women's sports spaces, and those predictions come true all the time now. Like, you got your Leah Thomas, Laurel Hubbards, and so on. So I think there's a lot there. Another point I'd make is that the other side has 0 studies showing that it can be fair and safe. But the point is, I made the back end of it, but not enough to... Yeah, it's just I'm annoyed that I didn't go.
So I guess the question that the next part of this process is to, why is the BJSM supporting a presentation like this? So I'm going to read out some of the stuff, and we're very careful in this podcast, hopefully, to give you a very objective view and let you as our listeners to kind of decide whether you are reaching similar conclusions to what we are. But this is a note on the BJSM website where they talk about meeting the editors from the 2022-2023 new members. They haven't announced anything for 24-25, but this is from the editor-in-chief, Jonathan Dresner, who says, I'm delighted to introduce the 2022-2023 new members of the BJSM editorial board. We have intentionally expanded the diversity of our editorial team, broadening our perspectives, expertise, and geographic representation. Each individual is extremely talented, as we're fortunate to have them on the team, etc., which suggests that there is obviously some mandate where they're saying, right, we need to be more inclusive. We need to expand our perspectives in terms of what we publish, which is all fair and true.
Yeah.
Then, just to read a second one, this is about Sheree Bekker, who has...
Sorry, just before we go into that, because it might take... In the sports sciences, like, there is a massive disparity between the research done on men versus women. When I was a student and we were doing our basic honors work, the name of the game was get a clean, simple answer. And one of the problems with studying women is menstrual cycle and how that confounds the finding. And so a lot of the time, the studies would deliberately exclude women from it because that was a factor that couldn't be controlled for, when in actual fact, it's probably one of the things that should be studied. And now it is. And so I'd like to think that 5 years ago, the gap was larger, and in 5 years from now, it'll be even smaller than it is. But there's no doubt it needs to be covered. And similarly, like, it's quite easy to do research at a very wealthy, let's call it privileged university, and you miss out what might be factors. And we can say this with some authority, like, the factors that influence performance in South Africa are very different from the UK and very different from the United States, because the young kids in this country have challenges, socioeconomic challenges that don't exist anywhere else. So there's no question that the diversity of sports science research needs to be enhanced. The problem is, how far do you go, and what is the implication of that for this kind of polarized debate from a scientific journal perspective?
Yeah. And the second bit I'm going to read out here is Dr. Sheree Bekker, who is the person that presented this particular presentation at the conference. I just went onto a website. We'll put the link in the show notes as well so you can read it for yourself. And it says, I'm an associate professor, senior lecturer in the Department of Health at the University of Bath. My work focuses on feminist perspectives of sport and athleticism. With a passion for challenging conventional norms, my research reimagines sport as a space for social justice, transcending traditional gender norms and fostering an environment where everyone, regardless of gender, can participate and thrive. And then there's a bunch of stuff afterwards talking about the book that she does. Maybe it is a slightly biased opinion, and I need to be careful how I say this, but it feels, when I look at this and encapsulating everything we've discussed so far, that, and I know you hate using this word wokeness, but the need to create this diverse voice has come at the cost of rigorous scientific evidence that puts the credibility of this particular publication very much in question, not only on this, but on anything they might do in the future.
I don't disagree at all. I think if that's your careful phrasing, then it's right. I mean, if that's not your careful phrasing, it's also right. Because I think the key point is at the cost. Because I don't think anyone should disagree that there's a whole branch of research and even advocacy led by research, evidence-based advocacy, if such a thing exists. So maybe that's a paradox, that needs to address inequalities and unequal investment and support for women's sport. That's true. So if someone was to come along and say, I'm going to add this to the literature, go for it. Most people should gladly endorse that, but they're not adding it. They're replacing it. Bekker and other colleagues are literally denying the realities of biological sex and its effects on performance in order to advocate that view. That's the problem.
Can I jump in there a second?
Yes.
I think inclusion's actually really important, and it's important that you do get different voices coming from different angles into these topics. Otherwise, you just get the same things regurgitated over and over again. So you can get fresh thinking. But I think the problem is that they are only listening to one side now, the BJSM, and they've already suppressed a rebuttal to the IOC framework, and now they've got this tweet. It appears to be that only one side is allowed to speak from their point of view. Now, as the man on the street sort of thing as I am, if I listen to this debate and I see the British Journal of Sports Medicine, then I'm going to take it as read that is the authentic de facto voice on this. And why would I listen to these other professors? Sorry, Ross, I'm not going to say tin pot professors, but professors I've never heard of over the BJSM. But if they're not allowing you your voice, which they have suppressed you, I think it's fair to say, then that's the problem. They can have their voice, that's fine. But you also need to listen to the other side.
Nice, exactly right. But again, it's like when it's additive, both things would exist. When it's at the cost of, one replaces the other. That's exactly right. But Gareth, now you understand the game. And it shouldn't be a game, but this is the game because the perception then of the other side as tin pot is exactly the point. That's exactly so when Gareth talks about suppressed, the IOC guideline on this issue was published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine. That's the guideline that includes, among other things, such pearls as there should be no presumption of advantage based on transgender status, which, let's be clear, is saying there should be no presumption of advantage based on biological sex, because transgender status doesn't exist independent of biological sex, unless you're arguing it from the side of Bekker.
Hence the reason why we had the issue at the Olympics
exactly the issue. Although that was a DSD case, not a trans woman case, but the biology is the same. That's the point. It's the same. So what in fact they're saying is no presumption of advantage. Now, if there's no presumption of advantage based on sex, then why are you giving 2 medals out, one for men, one for women? You should give one out and see how it lands. But we wrote a rebuttal to that. And by we, I mean Emma Hilton, Tommy Lindbergh, myself, Pike, Devine, and 20 other physiologists, because I think that IOC guideline was kind of the straw that broke the proverbial camel's back for a lot of people. They said, this is actually getting out of hand now. And it was published in the British Journal of Sports Medicine. So where do you go with the rebuttal? The same journal.
Same journal.
That rebuttal was rejected. And I want to read you 2 or 3 sentences. that were written by the associate editor. And when I labored my answer to you earlier in this podcast, this is why. The associate editor is the gatekeeper who sends it to reviewers that they can pick depending on what they want the answer to be. Okay, so I don't want this paper. I'm going to send it to people I know agree, and let's see how it lands. And you know you're going to get then unanimous rejection. This manuscript, this I'm reading now, uses language that is well established in LGBTQIA plus health to be transphobic. Specifically, this is the use of the word trans woman as one word as opposed to trans woman 2 words, or transgender woman 2 words. The use of trans woman is used typically by those in the gender critical movement to exclude transgender women from other women, and therefore a single word is used to describe them. Number 2, the same vein, the word cisgender does not appear in this manuscript. That's what this, so now scientific documents rejected on this basis. This is a standard trope. The authors employ outlandish declarative statements like testosterone explains performance differences between the sexes that are not based, I just not laugh, they're not based in science and do not pass face validity. Additional statements such as high testosterone exposure during male development explains the performance differences between sexes that justify sex-segregated sports are provided without specific citations. A review of the author's affiliations and competing interests piqued my interest. And so this is where you now you start digging into whether they've got conflicts of interest. Everyone's got some conflicts of interest somewhere. I was on the World Rugby decision that protected women's rugby. So the paper gets rejected for these reasons. Not a single substantive argument was even reviewed because it was deemed to be transphobic in its language. Okay, fine. Now, I remember writing back and saying, what should we use trans-identified male? Should we use males in women's sport? Because even the use of transgender woman or trans woman is to some degree a concession. But you try and make these concessions because you want to get your ideas out, but the ideas never go out because they're blocked at the gatekeeper stage. So we were pretty annoyed at the review. I think it was a classic example of excluding the viewpoints. And again, coming back to the start, scientific journals should host both.
Can you appeal that?
Yeah, you can write back and so on, and we did, and we even considered taking it to the parent company, which is the British Medical Journal Group. But in the end, you say, let's just go to another scientific journal because it's not really worth the trouble. And the problem is, like as I said at the outset, every academic has got some experience in the past of feeling that they've been unfairly reviewed. And the journal, if you ask them about this, they'll just say, we have a high quality of publication. This didn't meet it. We have certain standards for the use of language, etc., and you don't get in on the basis of that. And then you just say, well, okay, let's go elsewhere.
So let's just while you're talking about the reaction, so we did say that we did message the publication, and I'll read you part of what we sent so you can understand that we were quite friendly about it. I said, greetings, my name is Mike Finch. I'm the producer and co-host of Science of Sport with Professor Ross Tucker. We are eager to interview Professor Dresner, who is the editor-in-chief, about the presentation done at the BASEM conference by Dr. Sheree Bekker regarding gender and the transgender sporting advantage claim. We are intrigued as to why BJSM would support such a presentation and eager to give BJSM the opportunity to explain. Their response was, we will not, from the media relations manager, Emma Dickinson, replied and said, dear Mike, we will not be putting Professor Dresner or any other members of the editorial team forward for interview on this occasion. BJSM supports diverse perspectives on challenging topics in sport and exercise medicine. BJSM also supports BASEM, the conference, and the promotion of its annual meeting content. I mean, maybe this is a subjective view. It felt like quite an aggressive return back, and no concession as to we would like to write something back to you or at least give you a statement, nothing like that. They're basically saying we're not going to put this up for any kind of cross-examination, which was a bit disappointing because we want to present this to you as our listeners as a very objective view on the subject. And it was a pity that they wouldn't put somebody up for that, Ross.
Yeah, I mean, I laughed out loud when I read we support diverse perspectives. As long as they're your own, yeah. So that was, I mean, I thought it was a really poor, disappointing response personally. And then you followed it up and you said, look, we would really like at least a statement on the matter because I think it would give us an opportunity to present it fairly. You can read that out, but I mean, read this. Was it what? Did you get even one sentence back?
I got one sentence back saying we have nothing more to say on this now.
Yeah.
they
said nothing in the first place, guys.
Yeah.
So So yeah, that's kind of how it goes then. You know, we're not prepared to entertain any view other than what we have decided is the view. And
That's
I was just
scientific debate. That's scientific debate for you, is it?
so poor. Like before that, I'm thinking coming to this, give them the bent. No, there's
Maybe
no
we're not
grounds.
important for them to respond to.
Maybe, yeah. We'll see how the podcast lands and send it to her when it's done. Yeah, and again, I really wanted the opportunity to ask them, does the British Journal of Sports Medicine endorse, for instance, the 7 things that were said there? Is it true that male performance advantage owes nothing to biological sex? Is biological sex not relevant? Because as a journal, I don't know how you can adopt that position and then accept a paper that looks at any element of female. Like, this is a journal that published the statement on menstrual function and cycle and how it should influence training. They publish things on REDS, relative energy efficiency in sport, in which female differences compared to males is an important part. That's not that REDS doesn't affect males, but they'll publish something that inherently recognizes male female. But then this position seems inconsistent to me, and it's extremely disappointing for what should otherwise be a good journal. I've lost confidence in them.
Yeah. Yeah. Gareth, just a final word from you. I know we've touched on so many things here, but what are your overall impressions? I mean, the debate happening on our discourse channel, what's the general feeling towards the credibility of BJSM now?
I struggle with the whole topic because I'm quite sort of left-leaning myself, and I almost feel like I'm aligning with the right, and I shouldn't be aligning with anything but science. But I've had my eyes opened, and at least I understand the basics of the topic, especially because of what I read on Discourse and obviously listening to Ross. But I find that I now understand it, but there are people who don't. And this tweet has been viewed 358,000 times. Now, a lot of people will obviously be reading it and understanding it, but a lot of people are getting the wrong message as well. And it's this, I'm going to use the word again, suppression, I think, of one side of the debate, which is most concerning to me, because I've always thought that science is de facto science. It's fact, it's immutable, and I can trust scientists. I think I read a survey somewhere that scientists are one of the most trusted jobs in the world. And I'm starting to think that, is that even a case? So there's so many agendas going on here behind the scenes that the average person doesn't know about. Are we being misled? So I'm hoping that science isn't quite as riddled with ideology and politics as it seems to be right now.
Yeah.
But I'd like to ask you two, actually, is personally, obviously it's not sort of career suicide, but you're both putting yourselves in quite a space for antagonism. Why do you two feel personally that this is such an important topic that you devote time to it and put yourselves through the mill with it? Because you're a journalist, Mike, yeah? And this has obviously got your journalistic hackles up, hasn't it?
It has, because I think for me as a journalist working on publications and have done for years, credibility is critical in journalistic space. So, and I think this is under question now. So anything that we put in our magazines and anything I've ever done in the sports journalist space has always been based on quote the right sources, make sure you have credibility, because in this world that we live in, where there are, YouTube bloggers and so many trolls out there, it's very easy to be misled by certain things. So credibility, if you're a credible publication, credibility is key. That is how you make sure the truth comes out in whatever space you're in. This now takes away that to some extent. And I guess to some extent, I don't have a problem with wokeness, for want of a better term, but I have a problem with that interferes with the facts. And for me, I'm not saying there's a conspiracy. It's just strange that a publication like BJSM, the IOC, are so almost reticent to try and make the leap towards stating the facts. So there's this kind of there's a conspiracy theory part of me that says, is somebody or one person driving this narrative? I don't think that's true. I think this is generally what the world is like at the moment. But I would love to be able to spend a couple of months investigating this and really looking as to what is the source of this? Why is this being pushed so strongly? Because it's not like there are thousands and thousands of transgender people out there, but there are certainly a very strong component of people that are pushing it. So that's to some extent why it bothers me.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. Anything I'd say is it's not a conspiracy because it's actually happening in plain sight. It doesn't conspiracy imply that it's sort of happening in the shadows and it's like a secretive thing. There's nothing secret about this. It's direct and open. There's literally an IOC guideline in which you can read the playbook of this particular quote unquote conspiracy. My answer to that, in 2019, in Feb, I went to the Court of Arbitration of Sport. I was part of the Athletics South Africa contingent that was going to testify in the Caster Semenya case. At that case, I was used in both the World Athletics side and Semenya side to argue their point, which was a weird, bizarre experience. I was quoted in the opening and closing arguments of both sides. So I was like, I don't know which way I'm facing on this.
Well, that's
issue.
good objectivity.
I suppose that's the optimistic, that's the lemonade viewpoint to otherwise what would be a lemon. But I remember in preparation for that, like reading into the literature about testosterone. At that stage, remember, that was the solution. And a guy by the name of Tommy Lundberg, who is known to listeners to this podcast and in this debate, emailed me and said, look, I don't know what you've read on this and where you've seen it, but here are some papers, and particularly one from our lab that's looked on this. And I said, let me have a read of this. And I started reading, quote unquote, the 13. And I remember thinking, oh my goodness, I'm wrong on this. Not wrong, but incomplete. Because I hadn't had the need to read up on what testosterone suppression does and what the implications of that are. So to that point, I would have probably, the trans debate hadn't come up yet in my ecosystem or sphere. But had it done so, I probably would have said, look, lower the testosterone, remove the advantage, and let's get on with it. It's a compromised position. The moment you read those papers, it compels you to change your mind because there's no other, in my view, there's no other interpretation of it. And so I changed my mind. I didn't change my mind. I formed my mind based on the papers I'd read because at that point I'd had no previous opinion, right? I thought that lowering testosterone would solve the problem. It can't. It's not possible. So the reason I'm passionate about it is because people are making a decision that has profound implications for fairness and safety in women's sport without properly understanding the facts. And then when I see stuff like this, I don't know, something it hits me. It's deeply offensive to me to see alternative facts presented in the way that they were at that BAsem conference. So that's why I keep going back to it, because I hate the subject. I would far rather leave it alone and not be accused by numbskulls on Twitter of being a right-wing Donald Trump supporter. That's what happens. I'd much rather not do it. But the integrity of women's sport is at stake, and that matters. And someone has to take it up because a lot of people can't. Women can't. Well, maybe now they're starting to realize that they can and should. But there's, up to this point, women and a lot of people in positions of influence are too scared because if you stick your head up on this, they lop it off. You get sued, you get cancelled, Gareth, it is career suicide. There are half a dozen places I could go as a sports scientist that are now closed to me, and probably another 10 as a consequence of this podcast. I don't think I'll ever submit to this journal again. Wouldn't waste my time anymore. But that's the problem. There are consequences to speaking out, and people have been threatened into not speaking out as a consequence of consequences. That's a really clumsy way of saying, I hope you know what I mean.
Yeah.
But it matters. That's why we talk about it.
And I think for you on a professional level, working for World Rugby, to break it right down to the basics, that research that you've done, that robustness around the research done, means that you are making decisions and helping make decisions at World Rugby, which ensures that women's sport and women's rugby is kept safe from potential danger. That's the nub of it, really, to some extent.
And that mattered, like
it matters.
When I retire one day in 5 years, I hope. No, it's not going to be that quick. I wish. I will look back and say that contribution to protecting women's rugby is right up there with other things I've done. And it's not for me to say, but I will be proud one day of the fact that we were able to do that.
Yeah,
because it matters. It's got legacy implications, and it's the right thing to do for women's sport.
Yeah. Well, it's been a long debate today, and I hope that we've been able to explain this issue and the understanding and the real story, which is the credibility of this particular publication. Of course, we'll be discussing this, and I'm sure Gareth will get the discussions going up once the podcast goes up on our Discourse channel. If you want to become part of that, you can obviously engage with us on our Twitter feed or X feed. We're also on Instagram as well. But if you want to be part of the discussion or discourse, you can join us on Patreon for a very small amount each month. You can become part of our Discourse channel and put up your own thoughts about it. It's really a robust area of debate. And there is lots of discussions happening on that. But for now, it's goodbye.
Sure. Thanks, fellas.
Nice one.
I thought